Hello, all. You all may know, I'm not only a fan of science fiction and fantasy, but also of comic books. And one of my favorites is Vampirella. And I thought I'd tell you all about, where that started and how it started, and why I find the comic so good and interesting, and well drawn and well written. Um, when I was a kid, I used to go to a barber shop in Haworth, New Jersey called, I think just, it was just called Barber. Uh, and it had the pole and everything. And we had the standard Italian barber. His name was Carmen, and he spoke very little English other than the word haircut. And to my mother's consternation, he did not appear to understand the words, "Do not cut the sideburns," because the first thing you do was cut the sideburns. But he was right. I looked better without sideburns, and I would never object. Two things made the experience stand out from, well, three really. One, I was allowed to go alone and pay for it by myself, which was kind of, unique. My mom didn't usually let me do that. And two, he would give out Tootsie Pops after you got your hair cut, which I liked. Um, and I'd usually get a cherry one. I liked the cherry ones best. And then he had comics. And I mean, every comic you could think of, not just Marvel and DC titles like Superman and Batman and the X-Men. He had independent comics like EC titles like Weird Tales, Tales from the Crypt, Weird Science, Weird Fantasy, Frontline Combat, Two-Fisted Tales, things like that. And also Warren Comics, which also published a couple of horror titles like Creepy and Eerie. And they also published an ostensible horror title that wasn't really horror, which was Vampirella. And so a number of things drew me to Vampirella. One, the artist who drew her just drew her really gorgeous, and they had some of the best artists of the time. People like Esteban Morato and Ramon San Julian and Jose Gonzalez, a lot of really great Spanish artists, and the writing was really top notch as well. Vampirella was created by science fiction superfan Forrest J. Ackerman. They came to him and said, the comic book creators came to him and said, "What can you do that, we don't want to do the Mummy, we don't want to do, these universal, Frankenstein, Dracula comics. We want to do a comic that's new with a new character." And he thought, well, what if we do a female vampire and she's not from Earth, she's an alien? And they said, well, what are you going to call her? And he just off the cuff came up with Vampirella, and it stuck. Um, the background story is interesting. I should note that the initial cover, the cover for what became known as Vampirella number 0, though it's actually Vampirella number 1, was drawn by the late great Frank Frazetta himself, and he did not draw any of the interior artwork, but he did do that cover, which was very good and is like become iconic. And if you have an original copy, it's worth thousands and thousands of dollars if it's in mint condition, which few are these days. But it tells the story of Vampirella, who's from the planet Draculon. Draculon was a planet where blood flowed in rivers, and everyone drank it. It wasn't thought of as abnormal. And then there was a drought came along, and the society, basically civilization, collapsed as people started like drinking their own blood or each other's blood to survive. Vampirella escaped by sneaking on board a spaceship from the planet Earth, and hid herself away as a bat, and made her way there. She also had a kind of a plasma, which she kept in a unique looking bracelet. And that prevented her from having to feed on humans. She could use that plasma. It was supposed to be enough for a lifetime, but something went wrong, and somehow that bracelet got destroyed, and so she did occasionally have to feast. But unlike a lot of vampires, she's not portrayed as evil. She only drinks what she needs to, and only to survive. She, in fact, falls in love with a vampire hunter named Adam Van Helsing, who is a descendant of, the original Dr. Van Helsing, and works for an organization that hunts vampires. But again, they only hunt evil vampires, and Vampirella actually ends up helping him. She also meets a magician named Pendragon, and he's sort of a shady character, but he helps her along as well, and helps her to adapt to Earth and Earth's ways. The comic book has now been published for about 50 years. It is still going. When Warren Comics closed shop in the mid 1980s, it was taken over by Harris Comics, who was Warren's successor. And then when Harris Comics collapsed in the late 1990s, it's now published by Dynamite Comics. The stories are just as well written. It's illustrated by some of the greatest artists, people like Juan Jose Reap and Mark Teixeira and Don McTeague, and I can just go on and on. The top comic artists of the day have all drawn Vampirella comics, and it was through Vampirella that I actually first became aware of the character Lady Death, created by Brian Pulido and famously drawn by Stephen Hughes, but now drawn by some of those self-same artists I just mentioned. Because I read a Vampirella versus Lady Death comic book, and I thought, oh, who's this character? Who's Lady Death? And I started reading her comic books as well, and she is still also published. They are really the two surviving quote-unquote bad girl comics from the 1990s. Is Vampirella and Lady Death are the two characters whose books are still being published, and I highly recommend that both of them. Lady Death, again, is a very unusual character. She basically fights evil in hell, and it's both a horror comic and a superhero comic, because Lady Death is in her way a superhero. She's also a goddess, which I think is interesting, and it's a kind of a very cool backstory, and just really well drawn, really, an excellent comic, totally well written. Way above a lot of the other stuff. Even Marvel and DC and things of that sort don't have the quality of writing or the quality of artwork in Vampirella and Lady Death, so I highly recommend it. Anyway, that's where it all started. It all started in Carmen's comic book shop in Haworth, New Jersey, because he didn't understand the words, "Do not cut the sideburns."